I've spoke about the show The Batman in the past. How it was a show whose one major sin was not being Batman the Animated Series. A fact which sort of pushed the show into the shadows of Batman lore, much like its namesake. Which is really unfortunate because I think it's actually a unique addition to the overall Batman mythos. When the show first starts off, it tends to feel very villain of the weeky, which is understandable as it's the beginning of the series, so it's time to world build. Batman has one of, if not the greatest rogues galleries in the history of heroes, so there's a lot to pull from. But acknowledging that also makes you wonder how some of these guys even made the cut. Not that there's anything wrong with using obscure characters, but in a show that celebrates characters like the Cluemaster, it makes it that much more strange that characters like Two-Face and Scarecrow never make an appearance. The show's episodic in nature, giving the Caped Crusader a new threat to try to stop with each new story. But there's still an overarching narrative behind the main plot. The whole first season deals with Batman's relationship with the law, and to an equal extent, Batman's relationship with Bruce Wayne. Aside from the episodic threats which surround episodes' main plots, in the background there's a steady story between the show's leads. It's interwoven pretty expertly, because you could pick this show up at any episode outside of a two-parter and completely understand what's going on. Every episode is its own separate story without the need for further context, but you get more out of the season's arc if you actually sit down and watch the season. There are things happening in these episodes to connect them to previous episodes. There's a season-long story, but you wouldn't know unless you sat down and watched the full season. The show follows a Batman in his youth, years away from his prime as a crime fighter. This leads to a Batman feeling much more vulnerable when in combat. He's not as seasoned or experienced as the Batman of legend. He's still in the beginning stages of crafting that legend. The story begins 3 years into his mission to strike fear into the hearts of the corrupt. Upon crossing paths with local law enforcement, the GCPD looked to take in the Bat, treating the city's new vigilante as if he were one of the villains that he apprehends. This Batman is still making a name for himself, and he's not making any friends along the way. Being so early into his run as Gotham's Knight, he relies much more on Alfred than anything else. In a way, Alfred sort of feels like a sidekick here, or at the very least, a founding father of the Bat family, playing a vital role in both Bruce's day-to-day life and Batman's nighttime activity. The two truly do feel like a team. The look of the show alone is different than anything Batman-related ever done before this. Animated in the same vein as Jackie Chan Adventures, another classic show that I desperately need to cover here on this channel. This style wasn't a lens audiences were used to seeing The Dark Knight under. This new direction would ensure that this wouldn't just be Batman the Animated Series Part 2, which I sorta think was the MO of this show. The animated series was iconic, but this show's goal was to create its own identity outside of its more famous parent. As a matter of fact, behind-the-scenes snippets pretty much admitted as much when it comes to some of these characters' creations.
The intention was to bring together a new group of talent to sort of give the new Batman sort of a fresh take. We purposefully set out to not make Mr. Freeze as he was in Batman the Animated Series. Heart of Ice is such a classic. Why touch that?
What was important to us in doing the new series was to show Batman as he hadn't been seen before at a point in his career that hadn't been the subject of the prior series.
It was very daunting, very difficult to follow in the footsteps of the great Batman the Animated Series.
They made the show with Batman the Animated Series in mind and trying to deviate away from that. Although admittedly they didn't always succeed in that front. The Batman here definitely did bear a resemblance to the iconic Batman the Animated Series Batman. Their costumes are, well, sort of the same, almost identical. It feels like the same character just brought over to a new art style. Similarly, the Penguin seemed to be modeled after his original Batman the Animated Series counterpart, or more accurately the version of the character that variant was based on. This Penguin felt ripped straight out of the Tim Burton movies, with his three-fingered hands, his razor-sharp teeth, and his size and stature. The similarities don't stop at the design either because he was depicted in a very similar manner as well. Sloppy and oafish. Although he does have aspirations of resurrecting the Cobblepot name as opposed to further defaming it. and he's also now accompanied by two loyal henchmen called the Kabuki twins. Scarface and the Ventriloquist show up later, and they're also accompanied by henchmen Rhino and Muggsy, who are characters that were originally Batman the Animated Series creations. You have characters like Alfred, Man-Bat, and maybe even Firefly to a lesser extent, and they all bear some resemblance to the B-Test version of these characters. But that's a lot more forgivable because really, what are you gonna do different with these characters anyway? But the show did have plenty of other Batman characters that they recreated from the ground up. Like Bane, who went from a Mexican wrestler to the type of character you'd expect to see on Ben 10. Not that I've ever seen that show, but I imagine that this is what the characters on that show look like, if that makes any sense. Or Mr. Freeze, who goes from a frozen guy in a robot suit to the ice demon of your nightmares. Actually, a lot of the time, these editions were heavily altered to tell more original stories rather than retread previously traveled down routes. They weren't afraid of thinking outside of the box and taking risks, though those risks didn't always pay off. Bane was still a mercenary who desired challenge and profit, accepting money from the mob to go after the Bat in their belfry. But he's shown to have a lot more control over his circumstances, injecting himself with venom with the twist of a crank, only becoming a behemoth in size after his temporary transformation. He goes from looking like this to becoming a red inhuman giant with unimaginable strength and endurance. I was never really a fan of this, and I think the look sort of delegitimizes the character. He looks far too goofy to ever come off as threatening. And I think that sort of does a disservice to the character and any stories involving this character. Mr. Freeze looks like the iceberg from hell. His classic helmet was replaced by a miniature glacier, with only the silhouette of his head showing and his glowing red eyes beaming through the frost. With Mr. Freeze, they took a much more traditional approach to the character, painting him as a petty thief with a fondness for ice, and ice-based puns. Arnie, eat your heart out. He still suffered his tragic accident, but he's not the scientist desperate to save his ailing wife. Although now, as opposed to carrying around freeze rays, his condition has caused cold to form from his very touch. He doesn't shoot ice guns, he now shoots ice beams from the palms of his hands. He does carry his name over from B-Test lore, but that's about all he takes with him. The Catwoman design is heavily based on the Darwin Cook design from the comics, just now reappropriated to fit the style of this universe. While it's nice to see that look given some love, because it's one of the most famous Catwoman attires ever created, I don't necessarily love that look in this style, though it does make sense in the context of this universe. The show depicts the gangsters of Gotham City a little bit differently than its parent show as well. While shows like Batman the Animated Series and the New Batman Adventures played the mobsters off in a much more traditional and classic manner, being big bad businessmen in nice suits, this show has its criminals looking a lot more sleazy. Characters like Rupert Thorne or even Scarface feel much more like low-class crooks. They certainly don't carry the status they did in that other show, but you really can't bring up the show's character models without mentioning their iteration of the Clown Prince of Crime. This may be one of the most divisive renditions of the Joker ever created. There are those who love it, and there are those who hate it, and there's not a lot in between there. Personally, I happen to love it. The Joker is nothing like any Joker we've ever seen, but the character still feels like the Joker that we all know. If you think about it, it had all the aesthetics the character was famous for, having green hair, purple suit, and a Cheshire Cat-like smile. But everything outside of that was wholly original. His traditional costume was at first replaced with a broken straitjacket colored in to better suit the colorful man who wore it. His hair was long and messy, and for whatever reason, he had no use for shoes or gloves with fingers in them. The retooling of characters didn't stop at their appearances. The Joker was now a clown with the ability and agility of an acrobat. A true carny in every sense of the word. And unlike the Joker that most fans are used to, this Joker was a fighter. He could reasonably go toe-to-toe with the Batman. He's not stronger than the Dark Knight by any means, but on occasion he's been known to be a little bit quicker. Batman and the Joker have the character's classic dynamic, with the Joker feeling and proclaiming that the two are forever linked, and with Batman rejecting all of his advances. These two are polar opposites. The Joker performs his stand-up special for an audience of one stern stoic protector, though this clown isn't the only one who learned how to defend himself, as the Penguin in this has also been known to scrap. A penguin might be a flightless bird, but in this series it ain't a fightless bird. It's definitely a strange visual when you're so used to seeing the character commit white-collar crimes and sending his goons after his targets, to just see him suddenly throw down and go around to fisticuffs.
It's inconceivable.
Man-Bat isn't a tragic science experiment gone wrong. He's a lunatic who willingly and intentionally turned himself into a bat to compete with Batman. This jealous fanboy turned himself into a creature of night to try to get one over on the Dark Knight, all just to be the better Batman of the two. The Cluemaster in the comics was a TV show host turned criminal, whereas this show has him as a TV show contestant turned supervillain. Here he's literally depicted as a grown man who gave up on life and lived all his days in his mother's basement. The one original creation this season created was arguably one of the strongest story arcs, or maybe even the strongest, in the entirety of this series. In this show, Bruce has a best friend named Ethan Bennett. It's definitely different to see Bruce joking around and bonding with someone he has a long-standing history with, but given as such, we probably should have saw that it was going to end in disaster. Their friendship makes Batman feel a lot more human. He wasn't always just a nighttime crime fighter. He once had a life before the cape and cowl, and Ethan's a nice holdover from that. Their friendship is very endearing, and shockingly, it doesn't surround any major dysfunction, at least not at first. While Ethan and Bruce's friendship is fine, the same can't be said for Ethan's relationship with the Batman, as Ethan's actually a detective for the GCPD. And while Bennett's always been skeptical about the Batman, after seeing his good deeds, he begins to rethink his stance on the hero, ultimately deciding that Gotham needs the Batman. But the chief of police at the time wants the Bat's cowl on his mantle. Chief Rojas rages out at officers and their inability to arrest the Caped Crusader, with his vengeance against the Batman leading him to threatening Bennett's job. Going against his instincts and better judgment, Bennett tries to take the Batman in, only for him to be kidnapped by the Joker and used in one of his ploys. Ethan begins to become affected by Joker's patented putty, both physically and mentally. And yet, despite this, he's shown no affection by his employer, getting removed from his position due to his alleged incompetence. As Ethan's mind warps, his body begins to as well, and it's then that he transforms into the series' version of Clayface. The character carries out crimes out of a vendetta against the society that created him, trying to take his revenge on those he feels responsible. Both Batman and his partner, Detective Yin, try to reach out to Ethan and bring him back to reality, but in the end they find that Ethan can't fully be brought back. The Joker's rewritten his DNA and left his signature on it. The trauma's changed him, and it'll be a long time, if ever, that he'll be ready to come back to the life he was forced to leave. His arc ends with him peacefully parting ways and saying goodbye to his closest friends. The show gives audiences a full season to get acquainted with this brand new character, only to have that character horribly corrupted. It's a shockingly heartbreaking moment in a show that usually tried to tone down the darker elements of the mythos. This was the saddest origin story that this series had ever delivered, turning Bruce's best friend into Batman's biggest foe. I always sort of saw this as the Batman's take on Two-Face. Best friend of Bruce Wayne who's involved with city law enforcement, suffers some severe scarring, who in part blames Batman for his injury? That's textbook Harvey Dent. However, I think it's really well done here, and I actually welcome this more than a rehash of Two-Face's origin. This isn't just one of my favorite things the show ever did, this is one of my all-time favorite Clayfaces. Prior to his tragedy, his partner Ellen Yin offers a counterpoint to his pro-Batman mentality, trying to take down the Dark Knight at any cost. In a short time, Yin and Bennett begin to bond, becoming more than partners, becoming friends. They look out for each other even when their department is attempting to pit them against each other. While she's anti-vigilante at first, similar to her partner, she softens up on the hero over time. At first, allowing him to evade police after saving her partner, but ending that show of goodwill by claiming the next time they saw each other, she would take off his mask. Well, the next time the two had met up, Batman was knocked unconscious. Despite this, out of the kindness of her heart, she chose to respect his secret identity. Out of all the villains that appear in this season, only two make multiple appearances, those being the Penguin and the Joker. Probably because these are the brand's most profound villains and two of the series' standouts. It's always better to bring back who's inevitably going to be brought back anyway. For the most part, this season is your standard setup, creating a blueprint for this Batman universe for other seasons to map out. He meets a lot of his classic villains and develops dynamics with each of them. In 13 episodes, you get the cultural clash between the comedian and the man who's allergic to humor. You get his flirtations with a dangerous foe in Catwoman, you get an enemy of Bruce Wayne's becoming an enemy of Batman's in the Penguin, and even a villain almost breaking the hero in Bane. When this show isn't doing its own thing entirely, it's borrowing famous moments and quotes from previous Batman canon, but rearranging it for its universe. Upon Bane's arrival in Gotham City, the show essentially recreates Nightfall, just now under a PG setting, with Bane targeting the Dark Knight and breaking him upon arrival. The two-part season finale is in part a retelling of The Killing Joke, with flashbacks back to the character's origin, and a fight scene that takes place in a Hall of Mirrors, with the Joker even directly quoting that book. While these nostalgic nods are nice, I don't think they ever quite live up to what it is they're referencing. Personally speaking, I think the season's strongest elements were when they were trying to do something new and telling their own story. For me, their least impressive moments are when they try to recreate something that's already been done a lot better. While the character and situations this show brought to the table are dark, the matter's handled in a relatively light and child-friendly way. It still feels like the dark Batman you know, it just feels like he's been toned down a little bit. The show definitely put an emphasis on action. There was a whole lot of it, and a whole lot of it was good. It's well choreographed and well animated. Without a doubt, a major highlight of not just this season, but this show in general. There was always something visually stunning or aesthetically entertaining in every episode. Car chases and fight scenes are all obviously included, but this show could make something as simple as Batman running feel awe-inspiring. I think this show is worth checking out just from an appearance standpoint. It was always interesting to me to see their iterations of famous characters, because I knew I was going to see something that I was quite familiar with, but also done in a way that I'd never seen it done before. I don't want to speak in depth with the cast, mainly because I intend on covering each of these actors' time in the role individually, so I'll just leave it at, it's well cast. For the most part, they have the right people in the right roles. Standout performances have to include Tom Kenny's take on the Penguin, a part he would go on to play in other Batman media over the years after this, Kevin Michael Richardson's time as the Clown Prince of Crime, Peter McNeil as Man-Bat, Glenn Shaddix as Cluemaster, and Clancy Brown as Mr. Freeze was just a stroke of genius. And of course, former Batman Adam West as Gotham City's mayor. Rino Romano's a fantastic voice actor, but his take on Batman takes a little getting used to for me. Because this is a younger Batman, his voice isn't as deep or as gritty as many come to expect in a Batman performance. However, his cadence and enunciation is picture perfect. So while he doesn't always sound like Batman, he still always sounds like Batman. In terms of Batman cartoons, this is definitely in one of the top tiers, and its first season especially deserves that recognition. So if you haven't seen this series yet, I'd highly suggest checking it out. And if you'd like to see me check out the rest of it, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
"Oh, there he is, Batman."
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.